Hello and welcome to an online lecture on the United States and their involvement in the First World War. Before we get to the factors that explain American involvement in the war, the events that might explain American involvement in the war, and then finally the nature of American society during the war, I want to just quickly touch on the elections that take place from where we left off, which was the Spanish-American War and its aftermath, and where we're about to pick things up, which is the First World War. So, in this period where I guess we are looking at the latter part of the Industrial Revolution, the era that is sometimes referred to as the Gilded Age, or the Progressive Era, which is the response to the industrialisation within the United States. These elections are initially dominated by the Republican Party, and the Republican Party had been dominating for a long time by this point. McKinley, because of the success of the Spanish-American War, because of American acquisitions of the Philippines and Guam and Puerto Rico, to a lesser extent Cuba, McKinley wins the election. He wins the election because he's a real, I guess, if you like, kind of president who's a kind of hero who has brought great victory to the United States. And you can see that he wins this election. The electoral college vote really is a fairly convincing victory for McKinley. And he takes different parts of the country. He doesn't do so well in the south, which is really still the kind of Democratic stronghold, and the candidate William Jennings Bryan kind of swallows up most of the south, but not enough to even come close to winning this election. McKinley is assassinated a year after the election by an anarchist, and is replaced by Theodore Roosevelt, or Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt is therefore president before the 1904 election, but in 1904 he's re-elected with, again, a really comprehensive victory. You can see that the South is still the place where the Democrats dominate, which is really the opposite of the world that we live in presently. And what a remarkable victory for Theodore Roosevelt in 1904. He was one of the most popular presidents or has been one of the most popular presidents in United States history. He was a warmonger in a number of ways, favoured the Spanish-American War, as we will see, favours intervention in the First World War. But he also was someone who was willing to take on big business and corporations, and he was an environmentalist as well. He is responsible, Theodore Roosevelt, for all of the kind of great national parks that exist within the United States. And so some credit has to be given to Roosevelt for what he achieves as American president. He could have ran for another term because he had only been elected once, and although there was no constitutional law in place that stopped presidents running more than twice, there was almost a kind of unwritten code that you should only really serve 2 terms. Roosevelt had served 7 years, but it felt like 2 terms, so he decides to stand down, but he didn't have to. But he backed the individual who wins the 1908 election, which is William Taft. Taft had actually served under McKinley as the governor of the Philippines. So the Republican Party went again. The Democrats under Bryan lose for the 3rd time in a row. There is a sense that Taft would just carry on and continue with Roosevelt's progressive policies. He doesn't really, and Taft is nowhere near as popular as Roosevelt. So Roosevelt decides, after his little kind of sojourn to Africa, travelling, he decides to come back. He misses the attention and the adulation that comes with being American president, and he stands in the 1912 election, but the Republican Party do not accept him. The reason they don't accept him is because he is seen as being too much of a maverick. So he starts his own political party, the Progressive Party. What happens when Roosevelt comes back onto the scene? He splits the Republican vote. So this, almost 25-year dominance of the Republican Party comes to an end because the Democrats are able to take advantage, Woodrow Wilson is able to take advantage of this split in division within the Republican vote. There was another candidate at this point, and you can see this white section here, and that is Eugene Debs, the Socialist Party candidate. So the 1912 election is often referred to as the progressive election. There are 4 candidates, all with kind of different versions of a more progressive America, and the individual who wins is someone who is not particularly progressive in my opinion, and that is Woodrow Wilson, and I'll explain why that is the case in a moment. So Wilson is the man who is in charge of the country when World War I breaks out. Now, you'll know from watching the documentary on the Spanish-American War that just as the war starts to get a little bit messy in the Philippines, Theodore Roosevelt took the position that the United States really should not pursue this kind of interest in colonial experimentation, that America is not really a nation that should have colonies. And post Spanish-American War, the Americans start to think more and more again about the Western Hemisphere, their own sphere of interest, North America, Central America, maybe the Caribbean and South America. And you get a kind of return to some form of American isolationism, the building up of a wall to kind of keep others from coming into the Americas and from America themselves looking to overseas issues and concerns. So when World War I breaks out, America has kind of returned to an isolationist position, partly because Wilson himself, at the time when he's elected, wants to focus on domestic issues, but not just domestic issues, issues that affect the American sphere of interest. So on the American border, there's a concern with what is going on within Mexico. Mexico is a country which, as you know, has had a long history with the United States, and big chunks of southwest of the United States is actually territory taken from Mexico. If we go back as far as the 1846 Mexican War. Now, because of the close proximity to that part of the United States with Mexico, there is always the sense that America really should have some control over events in Mexico. And what we get, mostly under the Wilson administration, is intervention in Mexico. Really between about 1910 and 1914, America gets involved in Mexico much more than she should do on countless occasions. And Wilson backs some presidents, then doesn't back others, and backs a guy that he thinks is going to be the ideal individual to kind of lead Mexico in terms of having friendly relations with the United States. But all of this meddling, and even sending the troops into Mexico, the Marines into Mexico, to try and ensure that America can prop up the right individual to lead the Mexican people. All this meddling, on the one hand, actually causes the beginnings of the Mexican Revolution, and Pancho Villa, who's a much more radical than the Americans would have liked, comes to the fore in 1914. But in terms of the story that we're interested in, which is the causes of the First World War, America takes its eye off the ball in Europe. In fact, doesn't believe she has to even have an eye on the ball in Europe, because her primary concern is her own border, and therefore Mexico has her priority. When the Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in 1914, we think that it was a remote issue to people in Britain. It was an incredibly remote issue to people in the United States. Absolutely no reason whatsoever as to why the United States would need to get involved in this conflict that then breaks out after the July crisis of 1914. So Wilson, it's quite easy for Wilson to say, we're going to be neutral, that's going to be our primary objective, because what interest really did America have in this conflict in Europe? Maybe some hawks in the United States would have said, well, if America wants to ensure a global outlook, if America wants to make sure that she can still have some guarantee of access to foreign markets, that she should get involved. Now, Wilson himself is not completely opposed to this view. I'm just going to quote Wilson on a couple of times. These are quotes that you can find from the Untold History of the United States book by Peter Kuznick and also Oliver Stone. And in 1907, Wilson was still the principal or the president of Princeton College or University, he did say the following. He says, "The doors of the nations which are closed must be battered down. Concessions obtained by financiers must be safeguarded by ministers of state, even if the sovereignty of unwilling nations be outraged in the process." And then again, he kind of takes a similar view. In 1914, he says, "There's nothing in which I'm more interested than the fullest development of the trade of this country and its righteous conquest of foreign markets." So he's in favour of intervention if it doesn't necessarily involve war, although he does use the term righteous conquest. He's not necessarily talking about a military conquest, he's more talking about these probes and interventions that we see in Mexico. And if you recall from the Spanish-American War lesson, the open door of China was, the model that really should be followed around the rest of the world. And to some extent, those who may have favoured American involvement in the war in Europe would have argued that you want to make sure there are open doors within Europe, that America can sell its goods and commodities to European markets. And maybe if the Germans were to win this war, there would be less opportunity to have access to European markets. Britain's relationship with America always allowed the United States to have fairly good economic relationships with Britain. So there are some in America who do not favour neutrality, but Wilson does, and Wilson therefore leads the way. He was a president who was very focused on what he wanted to achieve, and he stuck to his kind of own ideas and morals and principles, and wasn't always that keen on listening to others, and he definitely didn't want to listen to the Europeans in terms of what they suggested. So Wilson is a man who favours neutrality, not necessarily for economic reasons, but for practical reasons, and the practical reasons can be seen in the fourth bullet point down. By 1910, the US population was as diverse as it had ever been up until this point. The population of 92 million had 32 million hyphenated Americans, and 8 million of these were Germans and 4 million were Irish. If you get yourself embroiled in a conflict in Europe where there are Germans, Irish who do not like the British, as you will be aware, the Irish and British will be at war with each other from 1916. The fear within the United States was, could some of that conflict in Europe spread to the streets of America? So the idea of Wilson was remain neutral, then the country will not suffer any type of civil unrest. It should be noted that Americans, though, had this tie to Britain, this special relationship, in inverted commas, that still exists today. If war was ever going to be something that was forced upon the United States, there was only one side that they would ever take, and that would be the side that Britain was on. But the last time that Britain and America were at war was 1812, right? The 1812 war. And over the 100 years after that, American and British relations are pretty good, with the exception of some disputes about the American Civil War, when maybe the British were a little bit more sympathetic to the South than they had been to the North. And then we had this little British kind of fallout with Venezuela, and maybe that was the kind of last time where the Americans had to say to the British, do not get involved in affairs in the Americas. But language, culture, history definitely tied Britain and the United States together, and there was an Anglophile in Wilson's administration. His closest advisor, Edward House, he really despised Germany and German militarism. And you have to remember that Britain is a democracy, whereas Germany is maybe in name a democracy, but ultimately Germany is an autocratic power. It would be very hard for the United States to support that country. So from the outset, Wilson was always going to be more likely to support the Allies if war was to come America's way. But he keeps America out of the war. In fact, the 1916 election campaign, which Wilson wins, it's a close thing, right? But he does win it. It was a tough one because the Republican nomination also had to decide, should America be pro-war or should America be pro non-intervention, and because the country had kind of favoured isolation up until this point. The Republican really had to just follow Wilson's lead, and therefore you're not going to be able to necessarily win the election if you're really taking up the same policies as your opponent. So Wilson wins the 1916 election on this ticket of keeping the country out of the war, remaining neutral. That is not to say that there wasn't pressure on Wilson to perhaps intervene or perhaps in some way punish the Germans. American neutrality had been good in one instance, right? In the one instance where it had been really good was financially. Now, America, under this kind of neutrality approach, the American government did not allow for loans to be sent to the Allies. However, private companies, private banks could not be told what they can and can't do. So this was really just the government who wouldn't lend money to any belligerent power. But JP Morgan Bank were delighted to assist and to send lots and lots of money to the British. JP Morgan, this is JP Morgan Jr., right? The JP Morgan elder, the man that we spoke about when we looked at the Industrial Revolution, that captain of industry or robber baron, has died, but his son was an Anglophile. His son spent half the year living in Britain. He was a Republican supporter and donor, hated the Democrats, hated Wilson, so he was happy just to give Britain whatever they wanted. And the British by 1917 had received $2 billion, some of this money went to France, but most to Britain, had received $2 billion worth of loans. The British really rely upon American loans to get through the war, and I'm going to come back to the kind of precarious position Britain is in financially just before America gets involved in the war later on. So America is neutral, however she's still trading with Britain, still giving money to Britain, and because America has built up her navy, or her commercial navy, over the last kind of 20 years or so since the turn of the century, she does trade with Europe, and American ships therefore have to cross the Atlantic. Now, the nature of the First World War, as you are probably aware, was that the British blockade the Germans pretty early on in the war, really from the beginning of the war, to hopefully starve the Germans into submission, and war would be over quickly. Obviously it doesn't work out that way, but the German way of circumnavigating the British naval blockade was to use U-boats, and you can see an example of one of these U-boats in the picture here. And these U-boats or submarines would be a real threat, a real danger to merchant vessels that would be crossing the Atlantic, and the Americans were conscious of the fact that their ships could be damaged by German submarines. Now, the Germans had started off the war with a policy known as unrestricted submarine warfare, and unrestricted submarine warfare was basically destroy any ship that may be helping your enemy. So if a ship was bringing goods to Britain, let's say it's wheat, cargoes of wheat, it doesn't even have to be guns or weapons, but something which was going to benefit the British in some way, then that ship was fair game to be destroyed. The U-boats would always give a kind of signal or a sign which would say turn around. If the ship didn't turn around, then it would be destroyed. And this unrestricted submarine warfare starts to drag Americans closer to war, because Americans are maybe going to be affected by German destruction of American ships and the death of American citizens. And in the picture here you see the famous Lusitania, which was sunk by a German U-boat. And when the Lusitania goes down in 1915, there are thousands who are killed, and 128 of these were Americans. And the pressure put on Wilson, especially from former President Theodore Roosevelt, is kind of intense, and Wilson has to kind of ride this. He does send a very clear warning to the Germans. He states that you shall not sink our ships, and if you continue to do so, then America would have to get involved in the war. The Germans do back down. They stop their policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, and there is a kind of sense that things calm down for a couple of years. Now, I should very briefly talk a little bit about Wilson's idealism. Right, Wilson was a kind of American president. In fact, he's the only American president to have a PhD, right? He was a technically Doctor Wilson, and he was an intelligent man, right? And he did believe in progress, as we could see with his desire for America to establish markets abroad. But he was also incredibly pious and righteous and a bit of a moralist. And he kind of felt it was his duty to kind of teach the world. It was almost his kind of a kind of power granted upon him by God that he should make the world a better place in his eyes, which would obviously be a safer world, a safer Europe. And he makes this clear in December in 1916 with a famous speech that he will then reiterate to the Senate on the 22nd of January of 1917, that there should be peace without victory. And what Wilson really wants to do here is teach the Europeans a lesson. How can the world be a safer place in the future? Well, let's establish a league of nations where countries don't fight with each other, they don't have alliance systems, they sit around the table and they discuss potential problems, and everything would be resolved in a kind of rational manner. So, as much as there are negative aspects of Wilson's character and Wilson's presidency, for example, he premieres the movie The Birth of a Nation, which was a movie which glorified the KKK. He was a white supremacist, I guess you could say, in some respects, Wilson. He obviously as well favours segregation of African American troops from white American troops during World War One. He has his serious flaws, but to give him some credit, he does recognise that a more peaceful world could be achieved by this League of Nations, which is the forerunner to the United Nations. You might not think the United Nations is the most effective of bodies, but it was at least an attempt to, the League of Nations and then the United Nations are at least attempts to try and bring resolutions to conflicts through peaceful means. Now the problem with this peace without victory, the Germans may have been keen on it to some extent, but Britain and France and Germany, we can discount Russia at this point, were so kind of tied into this war. You know, they had saw countless deaths, right? You know, close to millions of people being killed, and all the bloodshed, all the destruction. And here was this American president who had taken nothing to do with the war, coming along and saying, look, end the war, and neither side is going to win the war. We will have fair and kind of peaceful negotiations, because if we don't, this will lead to future resentment. Now, Wilson is right, because we know the future resentment of Germany is a major part in why we have the Second World War. The Treaty of Versailles is a key part of why we have the Second World War. He makes this appeal to the powers in Europe, but they fall on deaf ears. Now, you might say that Wilson is being naive, being saintly, being silly, possibly, according to the historian Gary Mead, because why would the European powers be willing to kind of give up what they had achieved so far? And both Germany and both Britain and France thought, well, just takes another few months and we will push further across the Western Front and win the war. So neither side is willing to accept this peace without victory. So what eventually happens, why America gets dragged into the war, is it seems really simple. You're going to do a little activity for me in a moment that you can do in your own time, which will examine the causes of American intervention in the war. And as is always the case with an event, you can look at the kind of short term, the actual events that take place, where you can say that is the exact reason as to why America gets involved in the war. And I'm going to touch on these right now, but there are maybe underlying factors that might have led to America getting involved in the war. At the moment, I just want to touch on the short term, the things that the American population think are the reasons for American involvement. And what we get is, on the 31st of January 1917, is the resumption of the German U-boat campaign. And this is therefore a threat to, once again, American ships. And on the 1st of March 1917, we get the kind of breakthrough for the British. Now, I did say I was going to kind of give you a little statistic, right? In 1917, things were not looking good for Britain. The financial situation, this is to quote the historian Gary Mead, the financial situation for Britain was indeed desperate. Its spending in America on vital munitions and other military and civil supplies was running at the equivalent of $75 million dollars a week in the first months of 1917. By April 1917, Britain's credit facilities in the United States were almost exhausted. At this current rate, it had an estimated 3 weeks before all means of American finance dried up. There was still £114 million in gold sitting in the vaults of the Bank of England, but that was it. Without further American credit, and it was highly unlikely that American banks would want to give Britain more money at this point, especially if there's no guarantee that we're going to win the war, Britain's war effort would have rapidly ground to a halt, leaving little option for the British but to sue for a negotiated peace. So Britain is right on the precipice of having to maybe bring this war to an end, because she is financially screwed at this point. She's relied upon the Americans, but the Americans really feel they cannot give assistance any further. So Britain has really one alternative option to suing for peace, and that alternative option is get the Americans to join the war. If America joins the war, Britain doesn't have to worry about further loans from the United States, because the United States will want to keep Britain in the war because they will be on the side of the British. So March the 1st, 1917, the British intelligence intercept a telegram known as the Zimmerman telegram, and this pushes Wilson towards war. And you can see the telegram on the right hand side here. Basically, the Germans were offering the Mexicans a carrot, right? The carrot was, if the Mexicans decide to get involved in a war with America, i.e. declare war on the United States, the Germans will eventually come and assist the Mexicans and will help Mexico defeat the United States. And after this, Mexico can have back New Mexico, Texas, Arizona, territories that the Americans had taken in the 19th century. It's a bizarre and desperate appeal from the Germans to try and keep America out of the war in Europe after the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare. The Zimmerman telegram, when the British find it, they run to the Americans and say, look at what we have found, you have to declare war on the Germans. They are trying to get the Mexicans to declare war on yourselves. And the Zimmerman telegram, although Wilson does not explicitly state it in his address to Congress on the 4th of April 1917, he does declare war, and Britain gets what they want. And it did seem like this was a bit of a jump for Wilson. You know, all of a sudden America is at war in 1917. You're going to read the address that Wilson gives when America does eventually get involved in the war. He basically gets a round of applause, a standing ovation, right? Americans are pretty happy that Wilson has now declared war. And Roosevelt is one individual who is particularly happy. I just want to kind of read you one little bit. Wilson, he stands up and basically states in this address on the 2nd of April, so 2 days before he formally declares war. On the 2nd of April, he stands up in the US Congress and states, "The world must be made safe for democracy." And this is really important, right, for the next thing that I'm going to focus on. When Wilson does decide to declare war on Germany, he wants to do it for the noblest of ideals, democracy. This is America not getting involved in the war for financial reasons, not to gain access to foreign markets, not even to help a kind of imperialist nation like Britain or a colonial nation like France. Britain and France are not really the issue here. The issue here is democracy, and the Germans are a threat to democracy, not just in Europe but possibly to the rest of the world. So it's the most kind of idealistic reason as possible that is presented to the American population, and therefore from the 4th of April 1917 America is at war and is involved in the First World War. It will take them a while before they start to send troops over to Europe. Okay, why exactly did the USA enter the war? And I want you to hear, again, this is in your own time, you're going to do this, but I want you to think about how you can combine primary sources with secondary sources. Here I've listed 6 reasons given by the kind of expert American historian on American intervention in the war, Jennifer Keane. And Keane looks at lots of different historians, and she kind of gathers all these different interpretations and puts them into this nice little summary that you'll see in the document that's on the next page. And you can also get this document on my site. So she argues that maybe American bankers go to the American government and say, look, we need to ensure that these British loans are repaid to us. So in order to do that, we need to win the war, because if we don't win the war, Britain will be defeated. Germany will dominate Europe, and Britain will not be able to pay us back our money. I should say, American bankers, I think JP Morgan Bank alone makes $1 billion in today's money from interest from the British during World War I. The fact that Britain, I think, was still paying loans back to very recently for the First World War tells us just how much in debt Britain was to the United States. So that may have been one interpretation. The historians who maybe take this approach might be of a Marxist persuasion. However, an American senator, on the night that Wilson declares war, or states that he's about to declare war, from Nebraska, George Norris, he makes this point on the Senate floor. Only 4 or 5 politicians actually stand up and speak out against American involvement in war. One is a guy called Robert Lafayette, and Lafayette is a progressive politician, and he says, look, once this war is declared, it will be the American poor who will be forced to go overseas and to kind of join the war, and I guess he was right as well in that instance. The second point was simple. German U-boat campaign was hampering American trade, so American exports, American capitalism being exported around the world was threatened by this U-boat campaign. What is the most important thing if you take this position? It's not democracy, it's American trade. The third one, German aggression led to American involvement. Americans were killed, leading to public pressure. Well, that's a hard argument to sustain, because in 1915 Americans were killed in the Lusitania incident, but America does not get involved in 1915. There are some more Americans who are killed after the U-boat campaign begins again, but Wilson does not necessarily bow to this pressure from people like Roosevelt and the public to kind of go to war for reasons of vengeance, if you like. The fourth one, a German victory could have long-term implications on America's world status. Now that is true. If Germany wins the war, and Britain is no longer a friendly power in Europe for the Americans, could America lose some of its status and some of its power in Europe? And so I can see why that would be a logical reason, but Wilson doesn't state this. He doesn't say we are going to war so we can control what goes on within Europe. Although you might say, why would he say that? You want to kind of give these noble ideas like democracy as a reason for war. If you've got slightly more self-interested reasons, you're not going to say them in public. We'll see that as we look at a number of wars in the 20th century for the United States. Number 5 says Wilson got involved in the war so that the US could play a part in reshaping Europe post-war. So the new map of Europe could be kind of American influence. America could decide, what European countries would look like after the war, and this could, I guess, in some ways benefit the United States. They could ensure that they would be the main global power post-World War I, which they are. I mean, this is a turning point in history. And then the sixth one, American imperialistic ambitions could be enhanced by having a seat at the peace table. Well, of course, Wilson's not going to say that America wants to enhance its imperialist ambitions across the world, that open door policies, free markets, chance to expand capitalism. He's not going to say that's the ultimate reason for American intervention, but it might have been a reason that was very much in his mind, that America can benefit from intervention and victory in this war. When you take all of these factors, I guess you need evidence to support. You need evidence to support them, and maybe you would find some of this evidence from some of the things that Keane says in her article, which you can click on, but also in sources 4 and 5, which are embedded in the next slide. you have speeches made by Wilson himself, and does Wilson in these speeches, which you can find in here, they're also on My City, does Wilson state in these speeches the reasons as to why America gets involved? Right, he is mainly talking about democracy and making the world safe. Now, if he is saying those things, should we take what Wilson is saying at face value? Should we accept what he says, or should we always take the approach that presidents are never truly going to say why they went to war? Why did George W. Bush say that America went to war with Iraq back in the early part of the 21st century? Did he say we are going to war so that America can kind of guarantee and ensure that it has a friendly power in place in a part of the world where oil production is fundamental to the American way of life? Did he say that this was a fantastic opportunity for American businesses and American military corporations to make billions of dollars? Of course not, right? He said he was going into war in Iraq to make the world safe for democracy, a little bit like Wilson, because Iraq had, well, she didn't have, but he told us that they had weapons of mass destruction. So always bear that in mind. What a president says, we should not discount it. We should always say, well, here's the reasons that are given, and maybe that is why America get involved in the war. However, you want to evaluate and challenge the president and what he says are the main reasons for getting involved in the war, and look at what historians have maybe argued could be alternative reasons. But Wilson says democracy, and that's what the American people at the time believed, which leads us to our final little part of today's lecture, which was what was the impact of war on American society. This is a fairly short section, but what I would say is, once war breaks out, it's not the first war America's been involved in, but it's the first war America's been involved in where the whole nation is expected to kind of get behind the American war effort, and for the first time we really see American propaganda in a way that is quite it's actually quite unsettling to kind of look at the types of propaganda that the Americans used during this period, and it's the pattern is then set for the rest of the 20th century after this. American nationalism goes into overdrive once World War I breaks out, and America's only involved in the war for about a year, right? But they go full pelt. And what is, as I mentioned earlier, the period that we might refer to as the progressive era, with all these attempts for social reform and trying to make America a better country after the kind of real inequality that is brought to the country via industrialisation. A lot of these kind of progressive ideas go out the window, and during the First World War, America becomes a place which is reactionary and oppressive. And we already know there's a reactionary element to Wilson himself. So I want to kind of take you through some, very briefly, some posters, some propaganda posters, and just to kind of give you an idea as to what I guess was the kind of feelings and the kind of atmosphere that were pervasive in America during World War I. As I say, this is a kind of precursor to what you will see during the McCarthy era, where there is kind of hostility to certain groups that might not be regarded as particularly patriotic. This first poster here that I've put on the kind of title page refers to the 4 Minute Men. And the 4 Minute Men were part of an organisation known as the CPI, right? The Committee on Public Information. I'm going to quote a little bit here from Peter Kuznick, the historian. And he says, unfortunately for Woodrow Wilson, not all Americans were as gung-ho as Theodore Roosevelt when it came to the declaration of war. Because anti-war sentiment had run so deep in much of the country, Americans just didn't want to get involved in foreign affairs, and that had been the way of things for a long time, as you know. The Wilson administration felt compelled to take extraordinary measures to convince the sceptical public of the righteousness of the cause. For that purpose, the government established an official propaganda agency, the CPI, as you can see in one of their posters on the screen. And this organisation was headed by a Denver newspaper man called George Creel. George Creel will come across as a bit of a reactionary, you could say, and a kind of propagandist in this story, but he was actually a progressive. He was not a kind of right-wing warmonger in any way. This CPI committee recruited 75,000 volunteers, known as the 4-Minute Men. Right, so here's 4-Minute Man poster. These men delivered short, patriotic speeches in public venues across the country, including shopping districts, streetcars, movie theatres and churches. It flooded the nation with propaganda, touting the war as a noble crusade for democracy, and encouraged newspapers to print stories highlighting German atrocities. These were German atrocities, mostly against poor Belgians. It also asked Americans to inform on fellow citizens who criticised the war effort. The CPI advertisements urged magazine readers to report to the Justice Department: the man who spreads pessimism or pessimistic stories cries for peace or belittles our efforts to win the war. And this is the kind of ugly element of American involvement in the First World War. And some of the posters that I'm now going to show you are examples of American propaganda that I say will be mirrored in future conflicts. Now, some of them are not overly dramatic, right? This one makes sense. This is the Irishman, so this is the hyphenated 4 million Irishmen or Irish people avenge the Lusitania. So we'll go and join an Irish regiment of the American military and avenge the Irish people who had been killed on this ship, because I should say the Lusitania, although it did see the deaths of 128 Americans, there were many more Irish on the boat because the boat was making its way back to Ireland. So that was, as I say, an understandable way to try and encourage Irish Americans to get behind the war. One of the things that the government realised, and this is something that happened in all countries, was you want to finance the war. How are you going to finance the war? Well, you get the public to buy into the war, literally buy into the war, by purchasing Liberty bonds, and this would be a useful way of kind of raising capital for war quickly. And you can see there are lurid visions of what America is facing. This Hun, the German, with blood on his fingers and blood on his bayonet. This is the dark figure that has to be destroyed to ensure democracy for the rest of the world. So I guess there's not any real surprise with this type of propaganda, but it's going to lead to an anti-German sentiment, which I'll come back to in a moment. Here we see, kind of appeals to Americans to act. Don't read history. Don't see this as being an event that is far away. Make history. Join the American Navy. Do your bit for the country. And also, you've got the flag in the background, an American liberty in the background, saying to this young man, you should really be doing your bit for the country. I guess attempts to recruit people to join a war are again not that surprising. There's a point that I should make here, and that is tales of the atrocities of the First World War. And when I say atrocities, I really mean the kind of brutality of trench warfare. That was quite clear. When war breaks out, Americans are asked to join, and you can see these posters here obviously encouraging that. And it's estimated that the American government would like 1 million men to sign up. Only 73,000 volunteered. That's because the American people were not that keen on going all the way to Europe, and that's because they had seen what was going on and didn't really fancy it. I must say, when Americans do get to Europe, trench warfare is kind of changing slightly. The Americans are much more on the attack rather than sitting in trenches for the majority of the First World War. They're kind of on the move. But nobody really wanted to go and be mown down by a kind of senseless attack across no man's land. So the draft was needed. Conscription was required in America for the First World War. This poster here is obviously an attempt to question an American man's masculinity. If here's a female wearing a Navy uniform saying, I wish I were a man so I could join the Navy, then why are men who have the opportunity to join the Navy, why are they not doing so? Be a man and do it, says the American Navy. Here is a little glimpse into the kind of moralistic tone that existed within the American government. Again, this Wilsonian idea that American men, American soldiers, should be pure and righteous, as this young man here standing with all of the helmets of Germans I assume he's just murdered, and on his shoulders the American eagle. So this is a very idealistic view of an American soldier, but the poster says, you kept fit and defeated the Hun, now set a high standard and come back to America and basically keep America clean, stamp out VD. And this is something that really freaked out President Wilson himself, but the American people. There's a whole history that you can study on venereal diseases and war, and why the United States in particular were really concerned about good American boys coming back with a kind of taste for European ways of doing things. Now, when America entered the war, the French government, and basically the French President, Georges Clemenceau, had said to the American head of the army, General Pershing, look, we've got state-sanctioned government brothels for our men. Would you like some for the American troops? And Pershing said, oh, no way. If Wilson even knew that you had suggested this, he would drag us out of the war right away. So the American soldiers were expected to go over here and be good young Americans who would not engage in any activities that could bring back to America unwanted diseases. You get the picture. Okay, last couple of things. Here is just what you would expect from I guess a government to say during the war. Be careful what you say because you never know who's listening. This is directed clearly at German Americans. What if German Americans start to pass on information back to the Kaiser, who is depicted here as a spider spinning a web? And then the final one, which is really blurry and you can't really see it, but you can explore this if you wish on your own at the time. In the state of Iowa, there was a proclamation made known as the Babel Proclamation. It became law, which forbade people in Iowa. Now, Iowa is an important state for this because there was a significant German population in Iowa. It forbade the speaking of foreign languages, i.e. German, in public places, including schools, churches, on the street, in trains and on the telephone. And this is censorship. Germans are basically being told, yeah, you are American, but you're an American German, so you're not quite the type of American that we would say is a true patriot. And I don't know if you can you probably won't recall the war in Iraq because you're far too young, most of you. But there was a sense that anything German was deemed to be unpatriotic. So during the war in Iraq, because the French decided not to get involved in the war in 2003, all of a sudden in America, you couldn't buy French fries in McDonald's, right? That was seen as being supporting a kind of cowardly nation, right? So French fries all of a sudden were getting called freedom fries, and this came from the government, who were kind of promoting this type of this kind of chat because the French didn't back the coalition that was going to invade Iraq. So during the First World War, you see something similar. You can find this in the Kuznick chapter, where you no longer had hamburgers. That was too German, so they were now called Liberty sandwiches. Sauerkraut was known as Liberty cabbage. German measles, this is the God's honest truth, Liberty measles, and German shepherds were referred to as police dogs. So you kind of get a sense of the paranoid nature that existed within America, and I haven't even mentioned the passage of laws, the 1917 Espionage Act and the 1918 Sedition Act, both of which curb free speech within the United States. In fact, former socialist candidate for the presidency, Eugene Debs, is arrested for speaking out against the war because Debs saw this as being a capitalist war. So, war breaks out, and America changes. It becomes a slightly much more patriotic, jingoistic nation. Becomes a more repressive nation in some respects. As you read the Kuznick chapter, you'll actually even hear about how women were treated. American women who were accused of being prostitutes during the war, they were seen as being a threat to German soldiers. So the country kind of really loses it in some respects. In terms of your overall understanding of this period, you want to focus on these questions here, just to kind of grasp exactly the full picture, the full story of American involvement, from the causes right through to the consequences. And as I mentioned briefly earlier on, after the war ends, the country, the United States, really does become the world's dominant power, because financially Europe is in real dire straits, and America has kind of become the financial capital of the world. It's already the manufacturing capital of the world, and it will then have the military, the most dominant military force in the world as well after World War I. So in that respect, World War I is very good for the United States. Okay, that's all for now. Thank you.